Okay, so you sent over a ton of research on earthquakes,
Mm,
and not just the science,
right.
but how people have thought about them, like through history and different cultures.
Yeah.
And it's really wild to see how we went from being scared of the earth to,
hmm
sort of figuring it out.
What's so fascinating is that the science part is just one layer, you know?
Right.
It's how we frame earthquakes, like what they mean to us.
Yeah,
That's where it gets interesting.
exactly. And that's what we're going to dive into today.
Okay.
We're going to look at how people made sense of these earthquakes
Right.
when they had no idea what was causing them,
Yeah.
and how, like, those early ideas actually led to the science we have today.
It's tempting to, like, just dismiss all the old myths as, well, just myths.
Yeah.
But they were actually really sophisticated for their time.
Yeah.
They were trying to explain something totally unexplainable.
Right, like imagine feeling the ground shake and having no idea why.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
You'd probably come up with some pretty wild stories too.
Oh, absolutely. Take Poseidon, for example.
Okay.
The ancient Greeks believed he was the god of the sea,
Right.
but also he was the earth shinker.
Oh, wow.
They both, like, revered him, but also they were terrified of his power to cause these earthquakes.
So if you felt the ground rumbling, you better hope Poseidon wasn't mad at you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it wasn't all just about, like, making the gods happy. Like,
Yeah.
in ancient China,
Mhm.
earthquakes were seen as these cosmic signals.
Wow.
Like, they reflected how good of a job the emperor was doing.
Interesting. So like a bad emperor equals earthquakes.
Yeah, pretty much.
Wow, that's high stakes.
Right. It's this really powerful example of how these events in nature
Yeah.
were, like, totally tied into society and politics.
It makes you wonder how those beliefs shaped how those societies actually developed.
Absolutely.
Oh.
But it wasn't all myths and legends.
Okay.
Even way back then, you can see the beginnings of, well, what we'd call scientific thinking.
So they weren't just making up stories.
Yeah.
They were actually trying to figure out what was going on.
Exactly. Take ancient China again. During the Han Dynasty,
Okay.
they kept incredibly detailed records of earthquakes,
Wow.
noting down the date, the location, the effects.
So even though they saw earthquakes as like signs from heaven,
Right.
they were still collecting valuable information.
Exactly. And it wasn't just them.
But,
The Greeks, like Thucydides, he was a historian.
Mhm.
He documented earthquakes too,
Interesting.
right alongside all the big historical events.
So it seems like realizing these events were important,
Yeah.
even without knowing what caused them, was a big step.
It was like, hey, this is important enough to write down.
Exactly.
It was a shift from pure storytelling to documentation.
Right.
And that really set the stage for everyone who came after.
But they were still a long way from, real science.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
But you can't, like, underestimate the leap those classical thinkers made. They started to move away from the supernatural
Right.
and propose actual natural explanations.
So instead of blaming it on the gods,
Yep.
they started looking for answers inside the earth itself.
Exactly. And the destruction of Hilike, this Greek city in 373 BCE, was a turning point.
Oh, wow. What happened?
So an earthquake and then a tsunami
Oh, no.
completely wiped it off the map.
That's a powerful reminder that nature is serious business.
It is. And that event really made people think differently about earthquakes.
How so?
Well, it sparked all this debate about what was happening under the Earth's surface.
Mm-hmm.
Like, philosophers, even Seneca, were speculating that maybe earthquakes were caused by, like, underground fires or vapors.
Okay, so not exactly right.
Yeah.
But they were starting to think about these physical processes.
Exactly. This shift from being afraid to actually trying to reason it out,
Yeah.
even if it was, basic, was a huge step towards a scientific understanding.
And it wasn't just the Greeks and Romans making progress.
Yeah, right. During the Middle Ages in Europe,
Yeah.
there was the Islamic Golden Age, and they were crucial.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about that.
While Europe was kind of in the dark,
Mm-hmm.
Islamic scholars were keeping that knowledge alive,
Right.
and they were building on it.
So, like, preserving the classics and adding their own observations.
Exactly. And guys like Al-Biruni and Ibn Sina,
Mm-hmm.
they were really challenging those old superstitious explanations.
So they were keeping the torch of knowledge burning.
Yeah, in a lot of ways.
And the Islamic world had these huge trade networks, right?
Exactly. They span massive distances.
So they could share earthquake reports from all over.
Yeah, and compare them across different regions.
That's amazing. It must have helped them see patterns in where and how earthquakes happen.
Precisely. This wider perspective helped them understand seismic risk
Yeah.
in all these different areas.
Okay, but Europe eventually caught up, right? What happened during the Renaissance?
Ah, the Renaissance. That was a time of like this huge explosion of curiosity and exploration.
And with explorers going everywhere,
Right.
reports of earthquakes started coming in from, well, everywhere.
So suddenly they weren't just the European thing anymore. They
Right.
were happening all over.
Exactly. It really challenged how Europeans saw the world, and
Yeah.
those Renaissance thinkers, always looking for connections,
Mm-hmm.
started to see links between earthquakes and volcanoes.
Interesting.
They began to explore how the Earth's internal heat might be related to these seismic events.
So it sounds like they were starting to put together a bigger picture.
They were.
Yeah.
This period was a big shift from just accepting tradition to actually searching for natural causes.
But there were still like big challenges ahead, right?
Absolutely.
I'm guessing one of those was the Lisbon earthquake in 1755.
Oh, yeah.
That was a huge event
Mhm.
that really shook things up, not just literally, but like intellectually.
Exactly. It was a pivotal moment, not just for the science of earthquakes,
Right.
but for Western thought as a whole.
Wow. We'll dig into that when we come back for part 2 of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
We'll see you then.
Okay.
So we left off talking about the Lisbon earthquake in 1755.
Yeah.
Not just a natural disaster, but like a philosophical one too, right?
It's hard to like really grasp the impact it had.
Yeah.
Imagine it's All Saints Day, right?
Uh-huh.
In Lisbon, this major European capital,
Right.
a massive earthquake hits.
Oh, wow.
Then a tsunami,
Oh, no.
and then fires just rip through the city.
Apocalyptic.
It was devastating. Tens of thousands of people died.
That's the kind of event that makes you question, well, everything.
Yeah.
Did it really shake people's faith?
Yeah.
Like the Enlightenment thinkers.
Oh, totally.
They believed in a good God, a rational world,
Right.
but then this happens.
It was a huge crisis of faith.
Yeah.
Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, they
Uh.
debated it fiercely.
What were they saying?
Like, how could a loving God allow this kind of suffering? It challenged the whole idea of a rational, predictable universe.
But out of all that chaos and destruction,
Yeah,
there was also this drive for answers,
absolutely.
more practical ones, less about theology.
That's where the Marquis de Pombal comes in.
Okay, who was he?
He was the Prime Minister of Portugal,
Okay,
a real man of action.
so what did he do?
He oversaw the rebuilding, of course,
Right.
but he also wanted to understand the earthquake itself.
So instead of just like putting things back together,
Yeah.
he was trying to figure out why it all fell apart in the first place.
Exactly. He ordered these detailed surveys of the damage.
Wow.
Sent out questionnaires.
Oh, really? Asking people what?
Where was the shaking the strongest? What did it feel like? How long did it last?
It's like a very early scientific investigation, born out of necessity, but still a
Yeah.
crucial step.
It was a turning point, the Lisbon earthquake.
Yeah.
As horrible as it was,
Uh-huh.
it became this catalyst for more systematic earthquake studies.
So are we saying that modern seismology was basically born in the ruins of Lisbon?
In a way, yes.
But it took a while, right?
Oh, yeah, another century for the science to really develop.
Okay, so what changed in the 19th century?
Well, first, there was this idea of gradual geological change.
Okay.
Geologists started to realize that the Earth's surface,
Uh-huh.
it wasn't static, it was changing.
Over time.
Yeah, over millions of years,
Oh, yeah.
shaped by forces we couldn't even see.
That must have been a mind-blowing concept at the time.
It was. And then there was the idea of deep time.
Okay.
Suddenly, the Earth wasn't just thousands of years old,
Wow.
it was millions, even billions.
Wow. That changes everything.
It did. This vast time scale
Yeah.
allowed geologists to understand how mountains formed, valleys, continents, the whole thing.
And earthquakes fit into that picture how?
That became key players.
Okay.
Geologists started to link earthquakes to specific rock formations,
Okay.
but most importantly, to fault lines.
So instead of being these isolated events, they started to see earthquakes as part of a bigger process.
Yeah, driven by the movement of the Earth's crust.
And this is where the seismograph comes in, right?
Oh, absolutely. Invented in the late 19th
It's a
century.
total game changer.
It was. For the first time.
Yeah.
We could actually measure the earth shaking.
Finally, some hard data.
Right. Not just stories and guesses.
So what could they see with this seismograph?
They could see the actual waves created by earthquakes.
Wow.
Measure their amplitude, their frequency, how long they lasted.
And that led to the earthquake magnitude scales, right?
Exactly. Scales like the Richter scale
Mhm.
gave scientists a way to quantify an earthquake's size.
So we went from like oh, the ground shook a lot,
Right.
to actual measurements.
It was the birth of modern seismology.
Pretty amazing.
The shift from just observing and speculating
Yeah.
to actually measuring and analyzing those seismic waves.
But there was still this big question, right?
Mm.
Like, how are all these earthquakes around the world connected? And that's where plate tectonics comes in, the big 20th century breakthrough.
Absolutely. Plate tectonics was revolutionary.
Yeah.
It explained how the Earth's crust is broken up into these massive plates that are constantly moving, colliding, grinding against each other.
And that's what causes earthquakes.
Most of them, yes.
So it finally all made sense.
Right. All those seemingly random earthquakes,
Oh.
they were concentrated along the edges of those plates.
It's like someone finally turned on the light.
And plate tectonics didn't just explain earthquakes.
Right.
It explained mountain ranges, volcanoes, ocean trenches.
The whole thing.
The unifying theory of modern geology.
Exactly. And with that understanding, we could create global seismic networks.
Yes. We could detect and locate earthquakes almost instantly.
Wow.
Anywhere in the world.
It's incredible how far we've come.
From a few scattered observers to this global network.
Yeah, constantly listening to the Earth.
And that brings us to the 21st century.
Where we're still dealing with the devastation earthquakes can cause.
Right.
But we have a level of understanding that, like, our ancestors couldn't even imagine.
It's a fascinating story.
It really is.
How human curiosity and, let's face it, the need to survive drove us to unravel this powerful force of nature.
But the story's not over yet, is it?
No, not at all.
There's so much more to learn about earthquakes.
Yeah.
And so much we can do to lessen their impact.
That's what we'll explore in part 3 of our deep dive.
Okay, sounds good.
The ongoing quest to understand, predict, and ultimately live more safely with earthquakes.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it.
What is?
We've gone from, like, being terrified of earthquakes, telling these myths,
Right?
to actually mapping fault lines and trying to understand the science.
It's pretty remarkable.
It really is. But
Yeah.
where does that leave us now? Like in the 21st century, what's changed?
It's almost like a paradox.
Okay.
We understand earthquakes so much better than ever.
But they can still surprise us
Yeah.
and devastate us.
Absolutely. It's not like we've solved the problem.
Not even close.
So what's different now? How are we approaching earthquakes in the 21st century?
I think the focus has shifted from just reacting to earthquakes
Mm.
to really trying to build resilience.
Okay, what does that mean?
It's not just about stronger buildings.
Right.
It's about resilient communities, resilient economies, even mindsets.
So it's like, it's not enough to know where an earthquake might hit.
Right.
We have to understand what it'll do to people,
It's
the systems, everything.
Yeah. And that's where the most exciting work is happening.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, early warning systems, for one,
Oh, yeah. I read about that system they have in Japan.
they've really pioneered that.
Even a few seconds warning.
Yeah,
It can be enough to, like, shut down trains, trigger alerts.
exactly.
It's incredible what they've been able to do.
And that's just one thing.
Geodesy, which is, it measures how the Earth's surface deforms.
Okay.
It's giving us unbelievably precise data on how faults are moving.
Wow. So we can actually see the Earth
But
changing.
we're literally watching it bend and breathe.
That's mind-blowing.
It is. And then there's all the work with AI and earthquakes.
Okay, is that actually promising or is it just hype?
It's still early, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
But machine learning is being used to analyze all this seismic data,
Okay.
looking for patterns that, humans might miss.
That's fascinating.
It could lead to better predictions, hazard assessments,
But-
even understanding how earthquakes get triggered in the first place.
So it sounds like we're on the verge of some big breakthroughs.
We could be, but technology is only one part of the equation.
Right. We have to actually do something with that knowledge.
Exactly. Better building codes, land use planning,
Yeah.
public education, all of that has to work together.
It's like we spent thousands of years trying to understand earthquakes. And now the challenge is to, like, outmaneuver them.
I like that. It's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And it's not just about engineering either.
Right.
It's about social resilience.
Right. Like communities that can support each other after a disaster.
Exactly. That's as important as any technology.
So the human side of this is still central,
Oh, absolutely.
even after all the scientific progress.
Even after all that, and that's what I find so hopeful.
What do you mean?
We've gone from fearing earthquakes as, like, these acts of gods
Right.
to understanding them as this, like, complex but natural phenomenon.
Yeah.
We may never be able to control them completely,
Uh-huh.
but we're learning to live with them, adapt.
And build a more resilient future.
Exactly.
It makes you think about all those ancient myths,
Yeah,
those early attempts to make sense of something they couldn't explain.
right.
In a way, we're still doing that,
We are.
just with better tools.
And more knowledge, this quest to understand earthquakes,
Oh,
it's
yeah.
been going on for thousands of years.
And it's still going.
It is. And thanks to all the scientists, engineers, policymakers,
Yeah.
even everyday people working on this,
Yeah.
that journey is leading us to a safer, more resilient future.
I hope so.
I think so too.
So to our listeners out there, if you're fascinated by this, keep learning.
Yeah, dive in.
Learn about the seismic history of where you live.
Find out what you can do to be prepared.
Exactly. The earth may shake.
But we can stand strong.
And build a future where earthquakes don't have the last word.
That's the goal.
That's a great goal.
Yeah.